Welcome to a podcast about anything, where we dive deep into the stories that shaped the world we live in. Today, we're unraveling one of the most controversial and secretive scandals in American political history, the Iran-Contra Affair. It's a story of secret deals, covert operations, and high-stakes deception. In the 1980s, at the height of the Cold War, the United States found itself caught between opposing forces in Nicaragua and the Middle East. On one side, President Ronald Reagan was determined to stop communism in Latin America by any means necessary, while on the other, the U.S. was entangled in a complicated relationship with Iran, a nation officially considered an enemy. Yet, arms were being sold, and hostages were being freed in secret deals that broke U.S. laws and defied the will of Congress. It didn't stop there. Funds from these secret arms sales were being funneled to a group of rebels fighting in Nicaragua, despite the fact that Congress had explicitly forbidden any U.S. involvement. The Iran-Contra scandal shook the nation, tested the limits of presidential power, and left behind a legacy of questions about government accountability and transparency. So, how did it all unfold? What were the consequences? And how did the U.S. government, with the world watching, navigate one of its biggest political crises? Today, we're breaking down the Iran-Contra affair, piece by piece. Stay tuned, because this is a story of power, politics, and the price of secrecy. Let's dive in. To understand the Iran-Contra affair, we first need to step back and look at the political landscape of the 1980s. This was a period marked by Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, where every conflict, coup, or revolution seemed to fit into a larger narrative of communism versus capitalism. It was a time when American foreign policy was defined by a strategy of containment, the idea that the U.S. had to stop the spread of communism by any means necessary. But what did that mean in practice? In Latin America, this translated into U.S. involvement in a series of conflicts where leftist governments or insurgent groups threatened to come to power, often with support or perceived support from the Soviet Union. One of the most significant examples of this was in Nicaragua. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, a socialist group, had overthrown a U.S.-backed dictatorship in 1979 and established a government that leaned toward Soviet ideals. For President Ronald Reagan, the rise of the Sandinistas was a red flag. He saw them as a key player in what he believed was a Soviet-backed attempt to spread communism across Central America. Reagan wasn't alone in this thinking. His administration was filled with staunch anti-communists who believed that allowing a leftist government to exist in Nicaragua could set off a domino effect in the region, potentially leading to the fall of other U.S. allied governments in Central and South America. To counter this, Reagan was determined to support the Contras, a group of anti-Sandinista rebels, even though Congress had passed legislation, known as the Boland Amendment, that specifically prohibited the U.S. from providing military aid to them. This set the stage for what would become one of the biggest political scandals in American history. But while Latin America was a key focus, Reagan's concerns weren't limited to this region. The Middle East also played a critical role in U.S. strategy. The Iran-Iraq War had been raging since 1980, and the U.S. found itself in a delicate position. On one hand, Iran had been a staunch U.S. ally under the Shah, but the Islamic Revolution of 1979 had transformed the country into a fierce adversary. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, was seen as a counterbalance to Iranian influence, but at the same time, the U.S. wanted to limit Soviet influence in the region. It's within this context that Reagan's foreign policy took shape. His administration was willing to blur ethical and legal lines in its fight against communism, and this led to secret deals and covert operations that would soon spiral out of control. The Iran-Contra scandal was born out of these pressures. The U.S.'s need to balance its geopolitical interests in Latin America and the Middle East, while maintaining an aggressive stance against Soviet influence. So as we move forward, keep this in mind. The 1980s were not just about two superpowers clashing on the world stage. It was about how the U.S. under Reagan justified questionable actions in the name of defeating communism. And in that effort, some rules were bent, others were broken. Now that we've set the stage with the broader Cold War context, let's zoom in on Nicaragua, a country that became a key battleground in America's fight against communism in the 1980s. This is where the story of the Contras begins, and where the seeds of the Iran-Contra scandal were planted. Nicaragua had long been a focal point of U.S. interests in Latin America. For decades, the U.S. supported the Somoza family dictatorship, a regime that was seen as a reliable ally but was also deeply corrupt and oppressive. In 1979, after years of violent resistance, the Somoza dictatorship was overthrown by the Sandinista National Liberation Front, a socialist group inspired by Marxist ideologies. The Sandinistas promised to build a more equal society and initiated land reforms, nationalized industries, and established close ties with Cuba and, indirectly, the Soviet Union. For the Reagan administration, this was an alarming development. Reagan and his advisors viewed the rise of the Sandinistas as a dangerous precedent, a leftist, pro-Soviet government right in the U.S.'s backyard. This fit into the larger narrative of the domino theory, the fear that if one country in a region fell to communism, others would follow. Reagan believed that if Nicaragua remained under Sandinista control, other Central American countries, particularly El Salvador and Honduras, would also fall under communist influence. In response, the Reagan administration supported a rebel group known as the Contras, short for counter-revolutionaries. The Contras were a loose coalition of former Somoza loyalists, anti-Sandinista militants, and various other groups united by one goal: to overthrow the Sandinista government. But the Contras were not without controversy. Reports emerged that they engaged in brutal tactics, including assassinations, kidnappings, and attacks on civilians. Human rights organizations and members of Congress were increasingly alarmed by the violence associated with the Contra movement, leading to a public outcry in the United States. In 1982, in response to this backlash, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, which was a series of laws aimed at restricting U.S. involvement in Nicaragua. The most significant of these amendments prohibited the use of U.S. funds to assist the Contras in their fight against the Sandinistas. This put the Reagan administration in a bind. On one hand, Reagan was deeply committed to supporting the Contras as part of his broader strategy to roll back communism in Latin America. On the other, the Boland Amendment made it illegal for the U.S. government to provide direct military aid to the Contras. Reagan and his administration were determined to find a way around these restrictions. They saw the Contras as freedom fighters, crucial to keeping Nicaragua from becoming a permanent outpost of Soviet influence. National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane and later his successor John Poindexter, along with Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a member of the National Security Council, began searching for alternative ways to fund the Contras. This is where the story begins to take a darker, more secretive turn, setting the stage for the scandal that would eventually unfold. The administration began soliciting support from private donors, foreign governments like Saudi Arabia, and eventually from the secret sale of arms to Iran, a country that was, at the time, considered an enemy of the United States. The money generated from these covert arms sales would be funneled to the Contras, bypassing Congress and violating the Boland Amendment. At the heart of this story is the question of how far the Reagan administration was willing to go to pursue its anti-communist agenda. The Contras, though controversial, were seen as a vital piece of that agenda. Even when faced with legal and ethical roadblocks, the administration refused to back down, leading to increasingly desperate and illegal methods to keep the Contras armed and fighting. So what we have here is a perfect storm: a fierce ideological battle, a congressional ban on military aid, and a U.S. administration determined to win at all costs. It's this combination that would eventually lead to the illegal activities we now know as the Iran-Contra scandal. But at this point in the story, Nicaragua is only one piece of the puzzle. Next, we'll explore how a country halfway across the world, Iran, became the unlikely player in this secretive operation. We've talked about Nicaragua and the Contras, but the Iran-Contra affair isn't just about Latin America. It's also about a secret deal half a world away in the Middle East. This part of the story centers on the US's complicated relationship with Iran and how it got tangled up in a covert operation that would lead to one of the most significant political scandals in modern US history. So, how does Iran, an avowed enemy of the United States, end up involved in a scheme to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua? To understand this, we need to go back to the early 1980s. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 had transformed the country from a close U.S. ally under the Shah to an Islamic republic led by Ayatollah Khomeini. This new Iranian regime was fiercely anti-American, and tensions between the two countries skyrocketed after the U.S. embassy in Tehran was overrun, leading to the infamous hostage crisis. The U.S. imposed an arms embargo on Iran, severed diplomatic ties, and classified the country as a state sponsor of terrorism. Around the same time, Iran became embroiled in a brutal war with its neighbor Iraq, which had invaded in 1980. The U.S., along with most of the international community, supported Iraq and Saddam Hussein in this conflict, viewing Iraq as the lesser evil in the context of the Cold War. But Iran, despite being an enemy, still had one thing the U.S. needed: influence over Hezbollah, a militant group in Lebanon with ties to Tehran. Here's where things get even more complicated. In the early 1980s, Hezbollah had taken several Americans hostage in Lebanon, including diplomats and CIA agents. This created an excruciating dilemma for the Reagan administration, which was under growing public pressure to secure the release of these hostages, yet publicly had a strict policy of no negotiations with terrorists. Despite this policy, a faction within Reagan's administration, including National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane and later John Poindexter, began exploring the possibility of a secret arms deal with Iran. Their thinking was that by selling weapons to Iran, despite the embargo and Iran's status as an enemy, the U.S. could create goodwill with moderate elements within the Iranian government. In exchange, Iran would use its influence to secure the release of American hostages held by Hezbollah. But this was no ordinary arms sale. It was carried out in complete secrecy, bypassing both Congress and much of the administration. And it wasn't just small arms. This deal included TOW anti-tank missiles and Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. This was a direct violation of the arms embargo, but Reagan's team believed that securing the release of hostages justified this high-stakes gamble. The first shipment of weapons was sent in 1985, and soon after, several hostages were released. But as more hostages were taken, the cycle continued. More weapons were sent to Iran, and in return, hostages were slowly released. The Reagan administration's goal of freeing American hostages became entangled in this increasingly secretive and illegal operation. So, how does this connect to Nicaragua and the Contras? Here's where the scandal really takes shape. The secret sales of arms to Iran generated a significant amount of money, and some within the administration saw an opportunity. Oliver North, a National Security Council staffer, proposed using the profits from the Iran arms sales to fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, circumventing the Boland Amendment, which prohibited U.S. military aid to the Contras. This plan effectively killed two birds with one stone. It provided much-needed financial support to the Contras, while also continuing the covert effort to free American hostages in Lebanon. North, along with key figures like McFarlane and Poindexter, worked to funnel the profits from these arms sales into a secret network that supplied the Contras with weapons and funds, all while keeping Congress and the public in the dark. This arrangement continued for some time. Hostages were being freed, weapons were being sold, and the Contras were being funded. But it was all happening in the shadows. The public, Congress, and even many within the U.S. government had no idea what was going on behind closed doors. At its core, the Iran side of this scandal was about more than just hostages and arms deals. It was about the lengths to which the Reagan administration was willing to go to achieve its foreign policy goals, whether that meant negotiating with enemies, defying Congress, or engaging in secret illegal operations. As these deals unfolded, the line between legality and covert action blurred, setting the stage for the explosive revelations that would come. So now we have two parallel covert operations, an illegal arms for hostages deal with Iran, and the secret funding of the Contras in Nicaragua. Two separate, highly secretive efforts that were, in the end, deeply connected. But all secrets eventually come to light, and when these operations were exposed, it would shake the very foundations of the Reagan presidency. In the next segment, we'll explore how these secret deals came crashing down and the investigations that followed. As we move forward in the story of the Iran-Contra affair, the big question becomes, how did these two seemingly separate operations, the arms for hostages deal with Iran and the covert funding of the Contras in Nicaragua, become linked, and more importantly, how did it all come crashing into the public eye? To answer that, we need to look at how these secret operations began to unravel. It all started with the covert nature of these deals. The Reagan administration had gone to great lengths to keep these operations hidden, both from Congress and the public. But as with most secretive endeavors, leaks, mistakes, and a tangled web of connections would ultimately expose everything. Let's start with the Iran side. By 1986, the covert arms sales to Iran had become more frequent, with missiles and weapons being shipped in exchange for promises to release hostages. While a few hostages were freed, new ones were taken, leading to a cycle of arms shipments and negotiations. The situation was becoming increasingly risky, not just because of the illegality of selling arms to Iran, but also because many within the administration itself were unaware of these secret dealings. The first major crack in the secrecy came when a small Lebanese newspaper, Al-Shira, published a bombshell article in November 1986, revealing that the U.S. had been secretly selling arms to Iran, despite its public stance against negotiating with terrorists. This revelation caught both the American public and much of the U.S. government off guard. President Reagan, who had previously denied any arms deals with Iran, was forced to address the growing controversy. Initially, the administration tried to downplay the scandal, claiming the arms sales were part of an effort to build relations with moderate elements in Iran and had nothing to do with hostages. But the story didn't stop there. The next big link came when investigators started to dig deeper into where the money from these arms sales had gone. It was then discovered that profits from the weapons deals with Iran had been secretly funneled to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, a direct violation of the Boland Amendment, which prohibited U.S. funding of the Contras. This was the smoking gun. Not only was the U.S. government breaking its own embargo by selling weapons to Iran, but it was also using the proceeds to support a war in Nicaragua that Congress had explicitly banned the U.S. from participating in. At the center of this operation was Oliver North, a Marine lieutenant colonel working in the National Security Council. North had played a pivotal role in orchestrating both the arms for hostages deal and the covert support for the Contras. Using a secret network of intermediaries, North ensured that the money from the Iranian arms sales flowed to the Contras, bypassing Congress and keeping the operation in the shadows. North was seen as a key figure in linking these two covert operations, and when the scandal emerged, his actions would come under intense scrutiny. The full scope of the Iran-Contra operation began to emerge, and soon investigations were launched by both Congress and independent prosecutors. As more details came out, it became clear that senior officials in the Reagan administration, including National Security Advisor John Poindexter and his predecessor Robert McFarlane, had known about and approved of these illegal activities. The scandal exposed the inner workings of a secret government effort to defy congressional authority and carry out covert foreign policy initiatives at any cost. The scandal rocked the Reagan administration. Public trust in the government was shaken as questions of accountability and transparency came to the forefront. President Reagan himself claimed he had no knowledge of the diversion of funds to the Contras, but the fact that such a massive and illegal operation had taken place under his watch was hard to ignore. It wasn't just about the illegal activities, it was about the violation of trust. The U.S. government had secretly negotiated with a hostile power, violated its own laws, and misled Congress and the public. As the scandal unfolded, the American people learned just how far the administration had gone in its pursuit of foreign policy goals, raising serious questions about executive power and the checks and balances designed to prevent abuses like this from happening. So, How did these two covert operations, arms for hostages with Iran and the illegal funding of the Contras, become linked? It all came down to money. The profits from the arms sales provided the funding that the administration couldn't legally give to the Contras. When investigators connected these dots, the Iran-Contra affair was fully exposed, revealing a secret foreign policy operation that defied both law and public accountability. In the next segment, we'll dive deeper into the investigations that followed, the dramatic congressional hearings, and the political fallout that ensued. Stay tuned, because the consequences of the Iran-Contra affair were just beginning to unfold. In this next chapter of the Iran-Contra affair, we shift our focus from covert operations to the public fallout and the high-stakes investigations that followed. After the secret arms deals with Iran and the illegal funding of the Contra rebels in Nicaragua were exposed, the Reagan administration found itself at the center of one of the most significant political scandals in American history. By late 1986, as the scandal began to unfold, public trust in the government was severely shaken. The American people had been told that the U.S. didn't negotiate with terrorists, and yet here was proof that the administration had done exactly that, selling arms to Iran, a sworn enemy, in exchange for hostages. On top of that, the illegal diversion of funds to the Contras violated the Boland Amendment and raised serious questions about the executive branch's willingness to circumvent Congress and the law. In response to growing outrage, both Congress and the Justice Department launched investigations into the affair. President Reagan, initially claiming ignorance of the illegal diversion of funds, faced mounting pressure. To get ahead of the scandal, he appointed a special review board, known as the Tower Commission, in November 1986. Led by former Senator John Tower, the commission was tasked with investigating the internal workings of the National Security Council and determining how these covert operations were carried out under the administration's watch. The Tower Commission released its report in February 1987. While it didn't directly implicate President Reagan in ordering the diversion of funds, it criticized his administration for lax oversight and poor management. The report concluded that Reagan had failed to properly supervise his National Security Council staff, allowing figures like Oliver North to engage in secret operations without proper accountability. Though Reagan wasn't legally implicated, the report seriously damaged his reputation, painting a picture of a president who had either been unaware of or willfully negligent in one of the most significant foreign policy operations of his presidency. The Tower Commission was just the beginning. Congress launched its own high-profile investigation, which took center stage in the summer of 1987. Televised hearings captivated the nation as key figures like Oliver North, National Security Advisor John Poindexter, and others were called to testify. Oliver North became something of a household name during these hearings. Dressed in his Marine uniform, North portrayed himself as a patriotic warrior who had acted in the best interests of his country. He admitted to destroying documents to cover up the illegal activities and claimed that higher-ups in the administration, including Poindexter, had approved of his actions. One of the most dramatic moments came when North described the secret network he had built to funnel arms and money to the Contras. He claimed that the end justified the means and that his actions were part of a larger effort to fight communism. Despite the fact that North admitted to breaking the law, his unapologetic, defiant stance gained him a surprising amount of public sympathy. Many Americans saw him as a loyal soldier caught up in a web of political intrigue, doing what he believed was necessary to defend U.S. interests. Meanwhile, John Poindexter, who had served as Reagan's national security advisor, took a different approach. He admitted to approving the diversion of funds but testified that he had purposely kept President Reagan in the dark to protect him from any fallout. Poindexter's testimony added to the mystery surrounding Reagan's level of involvement. Was the president truly unaware of the illegal activities being carried out in his name? Or was he simply insulated from them to maintain plausible deniability? As the investigations continued, the consequences for those involved became clear. In 1988, North was convicted on multiple charges, including obstruction of justice and destroying documents. Poindexter was also convicted on several counts, including conspiracy and lying to Congress. However, both convictions were later overturned on appeal due to legal technicalities, specifically because their congressional testimony had been immunized, meaning it could not be used against them in their criminal trials. Despite these overturned convictions, the Iran-Contra scandal left a lasting stain on the Reagan administration. While Reagan himself escaped legal punishment, his image was tarnished. He addressed the nation in a televised speech in March 1987, admitting that mistakes were made and taking responsibility for the lack of oversight, though he stopped short of admitting direct involvement in the scandal. His approval ratings dipped sharply during the height of the investigations but eventually recovered as the final years of his presidency focused on diplomacy, particularly with the Soviet Union. The fallout from the Iran-Contra affair also had a long-term impact on how future administrations managed foreign policy and executive power. The scandal raised critical questions about the limits of presidential authority, the importance of transparency, and the need for proper oversight of covert operations. Many Americans were left wondering how such an elaborate scheme could have been carried out without more rigorous checks and balances. In the end, the Iran-Contra scandal was a complex mix of covert operations, political miscalculations, and legal violations that tested the boundaries of U.S. foreign policy. It revealed the dangers of unchecked executive power and the consequences of trying to bypass democratic institutions to achieve foreign policy goals. While the Reagan administration survived the scandal, the Iran-Contra affair remains a powerful reminder of the need for accountability and transparency in government. In our next segment, we'll take a closer look at the long-term effects of the Iran-Contra affair on U.S. politics and foreign policy. We'll explore how this scandal influenced future administrations and the broader implications it had for the relationship between the executive branch and Congress. In this final segment of our deep dive into the Iran-Contra affair, we'll explore the long-lasting impact and legacy of the scandal. What was the fallout for American politics, foreign policy, and the way the U.S. government operates? How did the Iran-Contra affair shape the presidency and government accountability in the years that followed? Let's start with the immediate aftermath. While President Reagan avoided direct legal repercussions, the scandal had a significant impact on his administration. In the short term, his approval ratings dropped, and his reputation for strong, decisive leadership was called into question. The Tower Commission and congressional hearings highlighted the lack of oversight and control within his administration, leading many to view the president as either negligent or out of touch with critical national security matters. However, Reagan's ability to recover politically was notable. By the end of his presidency, his approval ratings had rebounded due to his achievements in foreign policy, particularly his role in reducing tensions with the Soviet Union and advancing arms control agreements like the INF Treaty. Despite the controversy, Reagan remains a highly influential figure in American conservatism, with many of his supporters focusing on his broader achievements rather than the stain of Iran-Contra. The legacy of the Iran-Contra affair goes beyond Reagan's presidency. One of the most significant outcomes was the way the scandal reshaped the relationship between the executive branch and Congress. The Iran-Contra scandal exposed the lengths to which a determined administration could go to circumvent Congress and the law, raising serious concerns about executive overreach. While the Boland Amendment had expressly prohibited U.S. funding of the Contra rebels, the Reagan administration found a way around it by funneling money from secret arms sales to Iran. In the years that followed, there was a renewed emphasis on strengthening congressional oversight of the executive branch, particularly when it came to matters of foreign policy and covert operations. The scandal served as a wake-up call, leading to reforms designed to ensure that intelligence activities were more transparent and accountable. One such reform was the strengthening of the Intelligence Oversight Act of 1980, which required that Congress be fully informed about covert operations. However, the Iran-Contra affair also highlighted the limits of these reforms. Despite the legal violations, many of the key figures involved, like Oliver North and John Poindexter, ultimately escaped lasting punishment, as their convictions were overturned on appeal due to the immunity granted during their congressional testimony. This outcome left many Americans frustrated and raised questions about the accountability of government officials. The legal and political complexities of the case revealed the difficulties in holding powerful figures accountable when national security is at stake. Another significant impact of the Iran-Contra affair was the long-term effect it had on the public's perception of government integrity and transparency. While Watergate in the 1970s had already shaken public trust in the presidency, Iran-Contra reinforced the idea that the U.S. government was capable of engaging in secretive, even illegal, activities to pursue its policy objectives. The scandal contributed to a growing cynicism about the honesty of government officials, a sentiment that continues to influence American politics. In the years since Iran-Contra, U.S. foreign policy has continued to grapple with the question of how to balance national security with the rule of law and democratic oversight. The affair serves as a cautionary tale of the risks involved when the executive branch operates without sufficient checks and balances. It raised lasting questions about the limits of presidential power, particularly in times of crisis, and the need for accountability in the highest offices of government. One of the key legacies of Iran-Contra is its influence on the debate over executive authority. In many ways, the scandal set the stage for later controversies over presidential power, including during the George W. Bush administration's post-9/11 actions, such as the use of enhanced interrogation techniques and the expansion of surveillance programs. The Iran-Contra affair forced future administrations to walk a fine line between asserting executive power and maintaining the legal and ethical limits on that power. So, what is the enduring legacy of the Iran-Contra affair? It's a story about the dangers of unchecked power, the need for government transparency, and the ongoing struggle to balance national security with democratic accountability. While the specifics of the scandal may have faded from public memory, its lessons remain as relevant today as they were in the 1980s. As we wrap up this series on the Iran-Contra affair, let's take a moment to recap what we've uncovered over the past 6 episodes. We began by looking at the political context of the 1980s, a time of Cold War tensions, where President Reagan's fierce anti-communist stance set the stage for covert operations in both Latin America and the Middle East. We explored the U.S.'s support for the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Despite Congress passing the Boland Amendment to block aid, the Reagan administration sought ways to continue backing the Contras, leading to illegal covert funding efforts. Then we shifted to the other half of the equation, the Iran arms for hostages deal. Here, we uncovered how the U.S. secretly sold weapons to Iran in exchange for the release of hostages, violating its own policies and international agreements. In our 4th segment, we pulled the pieces together, showing how these 2 operations were linked through the illegal diversion of funds. The revelation that profits from arms sales were funneled to the Contras marked the beginning of the scandal's public exposure. Next, we dove into the fallout and investigations, covering the televised congressional hearings that gripped the nation. Key figures like Oliver North and John Poindexter took the stand, and while the hearings provided high drama, they left many questions about government accountability and transparency. Finally, we examined the impact and legacy of the Iran-Contra affair. This scandal reshaped U.S. politics, fueling debates over executive power and congressional oversight. It left a lasting mark on American governance and public trust, serving as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and secretive operations. But we're not done yet. In our next series, we turn to another pivotal and controversial moment in American history: the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Was it a lone gunman, or was there a broader conspiracy? What really happened that day in Dallas? And why does the mystery surrounding JFK's assassination continue to captivate and divide people decades later? We'll dive deep into the evidence, the theories, and the unanswered questions in one of the most analyzed events in modern history.